بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So alhamdulillah, I've been asked to essentially give a review over a classical text written by Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya called Rawdatul Muhibbin, which you can loosely translate as the Garden of Lovers. Very interesting title, okay, and I'm sure many people are probably thinking, what is this book actually about? Okay, and it's a title that has intrigued many people in the past as well, and I'm sure many of you are interested to know what this book is really about, because it's a book that's not really discussed much in amongst the English-speaking population, maybe of Muslims here in the West. Nonetheless, it's a very famous book amongst of scholars of Islam, and also it pertains to matters not just related to the concept of love itself, but it also stretches across to other fields within our tradition, such as theology. And I think we'll touch more upon that point maybe in the next session next week, inshallah ta'ala. So this book actually was written by Ibn al-Qayyim when he was on a journey, when he was actually away from his library and his books, similar to one of his other books that he wrote called Zadul Ma'ad. And Zadul Ma'ad, the current printed version, is about 5 or 6 volumes. So he wrote those books completely from memory. Rawdatul Muhibbin is a lot smaller. I mean, here is the Arabic text here. This is one particular print, although one of the more recent critically edited prints is probably double the size. But nonetheless, it's a book that he wrote whilst traveling. And what I tend to find amazing about Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah is that whenever he wrote whilst traveling, he seemed to produce, that was probably his best books that he ever wrote whilst he was traveling. And there could be many factors behind that. Perhaps the opportunity to think and reflect and to be away from the distractions in life. And and so many other factors, I'm sure, as well. So this topic, so why this topic and why this book in particular? And I'll be frank here, that I chose this book not because just to attract people because of the fancy title, okay? And I know we live in a time where knowledge has been commercialized to a large degree. But really, it's an important topic that I believe, especially at university, students at university ought to reflect over and study. Many of you are single, many of you aren't married, and I'm sure the thoughts relating to marriage and relationships and emotions and dealing with love, etc., these issues do come to your mind quite a lot. And so it's important that I think we are all educated about these matters from an Islamic perspective, okay, so that we can essentially protect ourselves, not fall into sin. And also, I mean, as we will see, Ibn al-Qayyim, he doesn't just see it from the perspective of preserving or protecting yourself from sin, but it is actually to enhance your life. It is to enhance your spiritual life and to also enhance your quality of life as well. And that's something that we will touch upon, inshallah. So, I'll just quickly read what he said in his introduction as to why, or the purpose behind the book, and the main themes about the book. So after sort of introducing the book, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has essentially created different forms of love within creation. So we find that there is love بين محب الرحمن ومحب الأوثان. So you'll find those who have a love for their Creator, for the Most Merciful, and those who have a love for other than Allah, maybe idols, for example. ومحب النيران, those who worship and love fire, for example, fire worshippers. ومحب الصلبان, and those who love and worship the cross. ومحب الأوطان, then there are those who love their homelands, for example. ومحب الإخوان, and there are those who love their brethren in religion. ومحب النسوان, and those who love women. ومحب الصبيان, and those who love their children. ومحب الأثمان, and those who love wealth. ومحب الإيمان, and those who love faith. وَمُحِبُّ الْأَلْحَانِ, and those who love sounds, meaning music and instruments, etc. وَمُحِبُّ الْقُرْآنِ, and there are those who love the Qur'an. وَفَضَّلَ أَهْلَ مَحَبَّتِهِ وَمَحَبَّةَ كِتَابِهِ وَرَسُولِهِ عَلَى سَائِرِ الْمُحِبِّينَ تَفْضِيلًا. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives preference, and He considers the most virtuous form of love is those who love His book and His messenger, and that is considered to be the greatest love that exists within creation. فَبِالْمَحَبَّةِ وَلِلْمَحَبَّةِ وُجِدَتِ الْأَرْضُ وَالسَّمَاوَاتِ. And so it was based upon love, and for the sake of love, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth. And in fact, Ibn Qayyim has a whole chapter dedicated to this particular point, that existence came into being because of love. Existence came into being because of love. And you can only understand that once you understand the essence of servitude. Okay, so love is not just the wishy-washy sort of, understanding that many people understand it to be, but is at the crux of servitude and what it means to be a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he goes on to say that love is a means by which a person draws closer to Allah. وَبِهَا نَالَتِ الْحَيَاةُ الطَّيِّبَةِ. And it's through love that people attain a good life, a wholesome life. وَذَاقَتْ طَعْمَ الْإِيمَانِ. A person tastes the sweetness of faith. And so we can see he begins this book with a trying to illustrate to the reader that love itself is very diverse. There are various different types of love, and they have different purposes. And he sets off right from the beginning that the position of love within Islam holds a great position. Great position. To think that the entire universe was created because of love, as we will see why that is the case, then we will realize how significant this topic is. The introduction is fairly long, but he actually concludes his introduction with a very important point, and who will essentially benefit from this particular book. 5 minutes, yeah. Okay. So he says, وَهَذَا الْكِتَابْ يَصْلُحُ لِسَائِرِ طَبَقَاتِ النَّاسِ. This book is appropriate for people of all levels in society. Okay, so it's not just particular for those people who are married, for example, nor is it people for those who are lovesick, for example. It's applicable to everyone. فَإِنَّهُ يَصْلُحُ عَوْنًا عَلَى الدِّينِ وَعَلَى الدُّنْيَا. This topic in particular will help a person in matters related to their deen, as well as matters related to their dunya as well. Yeah. Yep. Okay. And he says, وَمِرْقَاتًا لِلَّذَّةِ الْعَاجِلَةِ وَلَذَّةِ الْعُقْبَةِ. This is a book that would essentially help you on the stepping stones to being able to live a more fulfilling life, an enjoyable life in this life, and to enjoy the afterlife as well. In it, he says, he will mention the various different types of love, rulings relating to them, the sound forms of love and the corrupt forms of love, the harms of it, the potential harms of it, causes of it, what prevents it, and ayat and hadith relating to this subject, and as well as masail fiqhiyya. So matters pertaining to fiqh will also be discussed as well. And this book as well, Shawaid Shi'riyya, it's full of poetry. Okay, so he actually wrote this for a literary purpose as well, in order to essentially be a casual read for people as well. And this is a point that he mentions later on as well. So he says this book will essentially, whoever takes it, they can take it as a casual book. It will make them laugh, it will make them cry at times. Other times it will help them to enjoy their lives more in this worldly life. But it will also help a person to perceive what will come in the life to come. You will find this book as a wa'idh, as a book that will exhort you and warn you from committing certain actions or having certain traits. It'll also be in a book of advice to you as well. So, I mean, this is how he essentially concludes his introduction. Now, in terms of the major topics of, or the main themes, now this book actually has a total of 29 chapters. There is 29 chapters. So it's quite. I haven't put all 29 there, but I've put the sort of major topics there. So the first part of the book, he actually, before he begins to discuss the names given to love or the different words that were the way we pronounce love in Arabic, he actually briefly speaks about the role of the intellect with regards to in relation to one's emotions. But that's a sort of brief chapter. But he spends a significant time speaking about the various different types of love, and he'll mention there are about 60 words in the Arabic language used just for love, which, as we will see, signifies something very important, as we will see. And then that chapter that I mentioned before, that existence came into being due to love. And then he has a section, causes of love. And then the section, some religious rulings related to some of these causes. And this actually, we can say, maybe approximately 1/10 of the book is related to this particular chapter. And you can see he really feels passionately about this particular topic. And you see it across his other works as well. So Ad-Dawa, for example, Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada, other books that he wrote, he spoke a lot, especially about things such as relating to one's gaze, lowering one's gaze, etc., religious rulings and the wisdoms and the harms of not doing so and the benefits of doing so. So we'll speak about that. And then he has an interesting debate between the eye and the heart. When a person falls into... One minute left, yeah. Okay, so when a person falls in, becomes, say, lovesick, or their heart becomes attached to someone in a healthy way, who is the culprit essentially? Is it the eye or is it the heart? That's something that he will speak about. Ishq, which is a more passionate form of love, which is more associated with one's maybe carnal desires, and then he will discuss, and this is a huge part of the book as well. I've actually written an article on this in 2 parts, which if you sort of Google my name and that word ishq, you should find it on Google. But inshallah, I think this is a topic that we'll probably start looking at from next week, and the other topics we'll look at next week as well. So I think we need to stop there for Salah, and so we will resume, I believe, immediately after Salah, inshallah.
Okay, everyone, we're going to go to prayer now, and what's going to happen is that we want everyone back in here no later than 6:40. Okay, 6:40. Everyone inside, inshallah. And fill out the feedback form.
Okay, Bismillah. Bismillah. Okay, so we were just going, in the last session, we were looking at the major themes of the book, and on point 6, we said ishq, lust, which, by the way, is a term which has different meanings according to different cultures and languages. So, like, for example, in Urdu, ishq is more, it's not as emphatic and as strong as it is in Arabic, for example. So it's quite normal for a person to refer to having ishq for Allah or the Messenger, for example. So you have this concept of ashiq al-Rasul, okay, which is quite a common term. But in other parts of the world, it can give it different connotation. But anyway, we will discuss that issue in some detail, inshallah. Then he discusses beauty and the position of beauty within Islam, which can get quite philosophical. Signs of love, the concept of ghaira, commonly pronounced as ghira, the concept of chastity, harms of fornication, and section 12, which I find very interesting, the love between a servant and his Lord. And this theme actually runs throughout the whole book. You see him sort of alluding to this particular point throughout the entire book, because if love is something which is experienced between creation amongst themselves, how does it exist between something or someone that we cannot see? Especially when we study or look at point number 3, the causes of love. The causes of love tend to be quite worldly, and so how do we understand that in light of love for Allah, and how does Allah love His servant? This can get very technical and very theological. So that is something that we will reserve until next week. And then the censure of passion. So he concludes the book with quite a large section of the book, censure of passion, essentially when people do not regulate their internal emotions and their desires. This is what hawa is. I mean, I've translated hawa as passion. People usually translate it as desire, but desire, it's quite a neutral term in the sense that there's good desires and there's bad desires. I mean, people have said the same about hawa, that there's good hawa and there's bad hawa, but in essence, here he will give a strong critique of hawa when it's unrestricted. There is another book as well, which is similar to this, similar to Ibn Qayyim's book by Ibn Jawzi, rahimahullah, called Dhammul Hawa, or the censure of passion as well. And the makeup of the book, it's quite similar. It's quite similar. So he begins by speaking about the moral makeup of man. So he discusses the aql, what is the essence of one's intellect or reason. He speaks about passion, hawa, jihadun nafs, striving against your own sort of desires, sabr, and the essence of the heart, the relationship of the heart with the aql, and whether love is something which pertains more to the heart or more to the intellect, which is quite an interesting discussion. Then he discusses vices and virtues of hawa, of passion and of desire. And when he discusses like the vices, so things such as unrestricted glances and unrestricted gazing, seclusion with the opposite gender in a haram way, fornication, adultery, warnings related to that, etc. And then a large portion of the book he dedicates to ishq as well. Okay, so this is quite a big topic. The topic of the ishq itself is quite big amongst those who wrote about this particular topic. So you have other great scholars as well, like Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, who wrote an interesting book called Tawq al-Hammama, which the Ring of the Dove, which I think has been translated into English. But he follows a different school of thought with regards to this topic. I mean, he's you can say liberal about this topic, and that possibly could be due to his own personal experiences. Okay, so Ibn Hazm had an interesting history, and if you were to look into his personal life, that seemed to have influenced his book itself. You had other scholars that wrote about this topic as well. One of the contemporaries of Ibn Qayyim was al-Mughultai, and he wrote a book called Al-Wadih al-Mubin fi man istushhida min al-ashiqin, or something to that effect, which is basically a book in which those who became martyrs due to their love, so they died out of love. So it's like a sort of Romeo and Juliet sort of story. So and in that book he writes the biographies and accounts of people who essentially became very ill or they died as a result of unfulfilled love. And he was chastised and censured for that severely. I mean, I believe he was even imprisoned because he was quite a popular scholar, a well-known scholar, and someone who wrote a number of books, especially related to hadith and hadith literature. But it just shows you that this is a topic that our scholars paid great attention to. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah has a very important book called Qa'ida fil Mahabba, just about the concept of love, in particular in relation to God, in relation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now moving on. So the beginning part of the book, as we said, Ibn Qayyim, he discusses the various different words to describe love in the Arabic language. And as we mentioned, that he mentions in the beginning that there are approximately 60 names given to love itself. And that indicates something very important, which is that the Arabs, generally speaking, when they consider something very important in life, they would give it many names. Okay? So from amongst those things are, for example, the lion. A lion or a predatory animal has many names. The camel has many names. Sword has like over 200 names. Sword played a very important role in pre-Islamic Arabia. Okay? Khamr, wine as well. Okay? So pre-Islamic Arabia, people were obsessed about wine. So they had many, many names. So love as well has had many, many names as well. So very quickly, if we can maybe just look at the common names with regards to love. Some of them I'm sure you are probably aware of, such as the first, the second there, and ishq on the right hand side, maybe shawq, and I was misspelling there, should be huzn at the end. Not huzum with an M, should be with an N. But we'll mention that inshallah. So mahabba or hub, both are similar terms. They come from the same root word. What does it mean? Okay. Now before, just to make this clear, Ibn Qayyim here, he talks about the etymology of these words. He's not giving the definition per se, because he goes on to say in some of his other works as well, that love is something which cannot actually be defined. Love is actually something that cannot be defined. Rather, it is something which its reality can be explained through its causes and its effects. Okay, so he will give a breakdown of maybe the root meaning, the etymology of the word itself, where it's derived from, and some of the signs that a person has love, and some of the consequences of it. But as for the essence of it, it really cannot be defined. So for example, if you were to pick out a rose, okay. There's real. Yeah, okay. So if you were to smell a rose, okay, how would you define that smell?
Like a rose.
Like a rose. Yeah, like a rose, exactly. You would say it's like a rose. I mean, it's you can't, because that's the essence of it. It smells like a rose. That's how you know it. Okay. There's no other way to describe it. You can give maybe some of its qualities, like it's sweet in its aroma or something like that. But in essence, you cannot describe it. Okay, so he is of that opinion that love is like that. Okay, love is like that. It's something that cannot really be defined, but it's something which has signs and markers by which you can tell whether a person has that or not. So hub and mahabba, that's probably the most common word for love itself. And he says that the origins of this word gives a meaning of safa or purity. As-safa, purity. So the Arabs would say, for example, someone who had like bright, clean teeth, that unadulterated white teeth, they would say hababul asnan. Again, his teeth is like brilliantly white. It's not marked with any other colors. And how is that related to love? In the sense that love is a very pure and natural characteristic. It's pure, it's good, it's wholesome, and it's not marked and it's not tarnished with something which is impure. Others say that it comes from ma'khudatun min al-habab. Some say he said that it's derived from habab, and habab is water. When there's a torrential rainfall, and you see the water sort of bouncing off the ground, yeah, that water you call it habab in Arabic. Okay, now you could see how comes they have a name for that. In England, we don't really have in English we don't have a name for that, but we're so accustomed to water, isn't it, and rain. But in the Arabs they loved water, they loved rain. Okay, so they had many names for rain as well. Okay, you'll find that in the Arabic language as well, because it's something they attach great importance to the extent that they would have a name for the water that bounces off that to describe that, which is quite interesting. So they said love is called after that. Why? Because it's in reference to غليان القلب, when the heart essentially وثورانه, when the heart essentially it literally comes to like a boiling point. And so when you boil water, what happens to the water? You see the water sort of like jumping up. Why? عند الاحتياج إلى لقاء المحبوب, when the heart is in a state of like fervent, you can say desire to meet its beloved, or to meet its beloved, or her beloved, or his beloved, or what have you. So they say this is where hub or mahabba it comes from. Others say that it's derived from luzum, which means to be attached to something, thabat, and that's why they say أحب البعير. Al-ba'ir is a camel. So إذا أحب means إذا برك ولم يقم. They say when the camel it kneels down and it's like stuck to the ground and it doesn't want to get up, you say أحب البعير. That is clinging on to the earth. So why is love called that? فكأن المحب قد لزم قلبه محبوبه. It's as if the one who is in love, it's as if his heart is attached to his mahbub and it doesn't want to depart. فَلَمْ يُرْمِي عَنْهُ انْتِقَالًا. And so he doesn't move from one place to another. Others say it's derived from قَلِقًا اضطراب, which means to be in a state of instability, because that's how you sometimes describe the state of someone who is infatuated in love in particular. And he gives many other explanations. Some say it's derived from a large vessel, because the heart of the person who is in a state of love then is as it's like their heart is a vessel which has been filled with the love for that particular person or thing, and you cannot fill that vessel with the love for anything else. So many other words as well that he mentions. We won't go through all of them, because the idea is just to give you an overview. Okay, and after mentioning actually hub and mahabba, he then goes to speak about the had, or the definition, as we mentioned. And as I said, he doesn't give a specific definition. He gives the you can say the effects of love. So huwa al-mayl ad-da'im bil-qalb al-ha'im. So it's when the heart is in a state of inclination to someone or something else. Okay, now the next term, which is hawa. Now hawa is an interesting term. Hawa, as we said, you can translate it as passion or desire. What's the difference between the two? Hawa in the Arabic language, if we look in the Arabic language, we find it's used in a number of ways. One of them, which means to essentially fall into, literally to fall, yahwi, hawa yahwi. As if to say that the lover, he falls into the desires of the beloved by destroying his power of self-control. Okay, so a person, he's literally falling into a pit and he cannot help himself out. He can't bring himself out. And so, and as a result, he cannot control himself. He cannot control his desires. So someone, and that's why you generally find a hawa in Islam is always censored and it's rebuked and it's looked down upon. The Prophet ﷺ said, ثلاث مهلكات, there are three things that will destroy a person. شح مطاع, when a person essentially follows his greed. وهوى متبع, when a person literally follows his شح مطاع, when he is obedient to his greed. It's as if he's become like a slave to his greed. And the second thing the Prophet mentioned was هوى متبع, when a person literally follows behind his desires. So wherever his desires go, that's where he goes. وإعجاب كل ذي رأي برأيه, and a person who essentially looks at his own flanks with pride and he sees himself and his own opinions to be better than everybody else's. So he's very arrogant and he has pride. So this is a person who's amazed by his own sort of thoughts and his opinions and his achievements. The Prophet ﷺ said these things are the muhlikat, three things that destroy a person. And if you look at these three things, actually they're quite profound because they represent different things. So the first is shuh, greed. And this pertains more to desire for like food and sensual desires as well, but it's usually in relation to, say, wealth in particular, shuh muta', wealth. And so you have the worldly aspects or the monetary aspects, you can say, of the dunya, and then you have hawan muttaba', when a person follows his, you can say, his carnal desires, his lower desires. Okay, that represents another part of a person's dunya and life. And then you have the third, which is one's intellect. Okay, and so these three things, they have to be governed and regulated soundly by the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. And if they're left to be untreated, and if they're left to, and they're left to sort of roam freely without any sort of restrictions, then that is when really corruption sets in the heart. When corruption sets in the heart. So this is hawa. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ hawa. As for the one who fears standing in front of his Lord, وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى, and he prohibits himself against his hawa, his desires, from falling into sort of following his sort of carnal desires unrestrictedly, فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى, then that person, his abode will be paradise. And in a very profound hadith, which is the hadith of that Imam al-Nawawi mentioned, his final hadith in his 40 hadith, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. None of you truly believe until his desires conform to what I have come with. Which is a fascinating hadith. Although many scholars say this hadith is maybe it's not rigorously authentic in terms of its transmission, its meaning nonetheless is sound. None of you truly believe until his desires conform to what I have come with. And I found it, subhanAllah, if you study the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi, you'll find that there's a thread that goes throughout all of the 40 hadith. All the 40 hadith, you'll find that they are linked to one another. And so he concludes his text, which is a text which combines all the fundamental principles of the religion, whether related to theology, whether related to mannerisms and akhlaq. And then he concludes and he says, none of you will truly believe until your desires conform to essentially everything that has been mentioned in the previous hadith. Okay, so it's a really, starting the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, to be honest, it's a life-changing experience. If you really study it well, okay, it can really affect your life in a positive way. That's why it's a book that really should really be studied by all of you. You should teach it in your ISOC, inshallah. Teach it in the ISOC, and that should be a goal of every Muslim. There's 2 books of hadith, just as a side note, there's 2 books of hadith every Muslim must read and study. Number 1 is the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, and number 2, Riyadh al-Salihin by Imam Nawawi as well. These 2 books are written for the layman, you can say. Books like Sahih Bukhari are more specialized, okay, and they're more difficult to approach for laymen. But these 2 books, 40 hadith and Riyadh al-Salihin in particular, they must be on the bookshelves for every Muslim. Other terms now, sabwa and saba, then these terms are you probably haven't heard of them as much, but it is mentioned in one place in the Quran. Does anyone know a term related to this?
Sorry, what was the question?
The term sabwa or saba. Okay, this is mentioned, one of the derivatives of this form or the conjugation. Huh?
The name Sabah.
Not the name, that's saba.
Okay.
This is sad. Whenever you see a dot underneath an S, that means it's a sad. For those who want to know the meaning of the macrons and diacritics. Yeah. In the story of Yusuf, I'll give you another clue. Yeah? Do you have any hufaz here?
Yeah.
Okay, when Yusuf alayhi salam, when he was trying to be enticed by the wife of the Aziz, he was fearful of his own self, isn't it? And he said, وَإِلَّا تَصْرِفْ عَنِّي كَيْدَهُنَّ أَصْبُ إِلَيْهِنَّ. That if you do not, essentially, oh Allah, if you don't divert their plots away from me, أَصْبُ إِلَيْهِنَّ, meaning I will incline towards them, and I will be from the ignorant. So this was Yusuf alayhi salam, a prophet of God. Okay, remember this. So even he felt worried that he might be affected by this state. Okay, and shaghaf as well is another term which is also mentioned in the Quran, also in Surah Yusuf as well. So Surah Yusuf is a good place actually if you really want to look at the concept of love as well. It's a profound surah for that, because you see the love between Yaqub and Yusuf. So you see that sort of parental love. You see love between brothers, okay, and the opposite of that as well. And you see the love between a man and a woman as well. So and shaghaf, Allah described the wife of the Aziz, قَدَ شَغَفَهَا حُبًّا, that she was literally overwhelmed by that love. That love became a part of her shaghaf, and the shaghaf is like a part of, I don't know the anatomy of the heart well, but it is said that the heart has a ghilaf, like a covering, okay? Is that how you?
Pericardium.
Yeah. Okay. So he said that when a person's love reaches that extent, is that in the upper part of the heart, or is it
around?
Is around it? So, oh, there you go. Okay, so it's literally, yeah, so it encompasses the entire heart, basically. This is sharaf. So this is sharaf. There you go, I learned. What was it again?
Pericardium.
Pericardium.
Cardium.
Okay. Okay. Wajd now. Wajd is another term which is used quite a lot, especially in poetry. And wajd is a sadness that is a love that is associated with sadness. Okay, so melancholy and similar to that. And I mean, how can love lead to sadness? Well, in many ways. Okay, in many ways. One of the ways is if a person is in a state of love and they cannot be with their beloved. Okay. This leads to a type of sadness. And if you look to pre-Islamic literature and the sort of literature that, and even novels, and if you've maybe read Majnun Layla, okay, similar to even Romeo and Juliet, the sort of common denominator in all of those is that love intensifies when the person is not with their beloved. Okay, love intensifies when they're not with their beloved, until it leads to an illness. So in the case of Majnun, okay, it led to his illness. He became mad, and then you have Romeo and Juliet as well, and which a number of people say actually is taken from Majnun Layla. Okay, Majnun and Layla, which is an interesting point. Why? Because what you'll find is that the scholars, he also has a chapter on this. I didn't mention this, but Ibn Qayyim has a chapter on this. He said there is a topic within this book which covers essentially what nullifies love or what decreases it. Okay? And one of the things that scholars spoke about and differed over was whether intimacy actually decreases one's state of love or whether it actually increases it. Okay? Now, there are two camps. So obviously there are those who said no, it increases it. And from one perspective, that's quite logical, yeah? That intimacy will increase one's love. But for another group of scholars, they said no, actually it kills off that love. This is if the love was based more upon a type of ishq or a type of passionate or a carnal desire type of love. Okay? Which is what is usually associated with people that haven't experienced intimacy before. Okay? And that's quite common amongst youth. That's quite common amongst youth. It's quite common amongst people who feel as though they've fallen into love, okay, even though they haven't experienced intimacy or they haven't been married before or what have you. And so there is a type of, they are, due to their lack of experience, their mind wanders. Okay, due to lack of experience and the lack of intimacy and not experiencing intimacy, the mind sort of wonders and it wonders what it means to be with somebody else. Okay, and this can be very dangerous. This can be very dangerous. In the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said that two people that are in a state of love have never experienced anything as good as marriage. Okay, meaning that once they become married, they essentially it helps to stabilize the relationship itself. Because prior to that, it's emotions just gone everywhere, basically. So that's wajd. Okay. Other terms, you have kalaf, you have tatayyum. Tatayyum is an interesting one because tatayyum is usually associated with servitude and worship. And so Taymullah is an expression in reference to Abdullah. So Taymullah and Tatayyum, they share the same roots. So this is when a person becomes literally infatuated with a thing or with a person to the extent that they end up worshipping that person. Just the other day actually, this was a few days ago, a brother, he came into the masjid and he was in a very strange relationship. So this is he's in a relationship. He was in a relationship with this girl outside of marriage, and he was literally crazy about her. And he actually told her, and he said it to me, that he wants to worship her. Okay, and he wanted to worship her, And as a result, what happened was, it was a bit like a horror story. It was the stories of telling because it was related to black magic and jinns and what have you. And I mean, the guy was really, really gullible and really naive. But it was after that point where he said to her that he wanted to worship her, that there was a lot of sihr and magic that became apparent, and black magic essentially. I won't go into the details. I don't want to scare you a lot away, but it's tatayyum. It can lead to that extent, and obviously this type of love, it's uncontrolled, and a person, if there is any type of love that leads to servitude, then that should be reserved only for Allah. But at the same time, this is not carnal, or love based upon carnal desires. Ishq itself, I'm going to leave until next week, so I'm not going to discuss it. And then you have some other terms. I've just realized I've put tatayyun there twice, so just ignore that. The last one, though, is an interesting one, which Ibn Qayyim mentions, which is huzn. So huzn, where are we? So huzn, how do you usually translate huzn? Does anyone know? Sadness.
Depression.
So he says sadness is also categorized as a form of love, which is very interesting. And I'm sure many of you are quite confused by that. Where are we? Okay, لماذا عد الحزن من أسماء المحبة? He posed this question. Why is sadness considered to be from one of the names of love? He said, وأما الحزن فقد عد من أسماء المحبة. As for huzn, it was considered, okay, so he mentions it in the passive voice here, it was considered to be from the names of love. والصواب أنه ليس من أسمائها. But he opts for the view straight away that it is not from the names of love. وإنما هو حالة تحدث للمحب. But rather what it is, he essentially says it's a state that a person who's in love might experience. It's a state that they might experience. وهي ورود المكروه عليه وخلاف المسرة. And also in some of his other works, in particular his book Madarij al-Salikin, which is really probably his greatest work, which is an explanation of Manazil al-Sa'irin by Imam al-Harawi. And Imam al-Harawi, what he did in this book was essentially explain all the various different spiritual states that a person sort of passes on when worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the spiritual stations that he mentioned was sadness, okay, which is quite common, especially amongst more of the mutasawwifin or the Sufis. Okay, they consider it to be a station of servitude. But he vehemently opposed that understanding. And he said no, because if you look in the Quran and Sunnah, you find that huzn has only been mentioned in a negative way. Huzn has never been mentioned in a positive way. So, how can it be good? And the Prophet used to seek refuge in Allah from al-huzn. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazn. He said, oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from distress and grief and sadness. So how can it be something good? Well, those who argued that there is some positivity to it, they say a person who experiences sadness in life is more in tune with their sort of inner disposition. Okay? So, for example, you will never say that a person is complete if they've never experienced happiness. Would you ever say that? If a person has never experienced happiness, would you say that they are complete as an individual? No. Okay, but why do we have to say completeness is only attained by experiencing positive qualities? Completeness can also be attained by experiencing some of the negative qualities and emotions as well. And interestingly, you'll find, if you look at the biographies of all of the prophets, they led very difficult lives and they experienced a lot of sadness. Okay, look at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was an orphan. His parents died as a child. he was exiled from his homeland, he was treated in such a miserable way by his own people, etc. I mean, that's not to say that he was sad, but he experienced elements of that. Okay? And so, but how, anyway, the point is, how is that related to love itself? In other passages, Ibn Qayyim, I believe he explains it in more detail. He says that when a person becomes infatuated or is in love with something or someone to an extreme, that love can punish that person in a number of ways, which leads that person to experience grief and sadness. So, for example, if you love something so much, any more than that you should love Allah and the religion, etc., that love will torture you, because you, before the stage that you attain that thing that you love. Okay, so if you are in pursuit of your beloved, whatever it may be, whoever it may be, okay, and up until that point, you are in a state of anxiety and sadness, the fact that you cannot reach your mahbub. The second stage is once you've attained it, then you are in a state of worry and grief and anxiety that you might lose that person or that thing which is beloved to you. And thirdly, the obvious one is when after you lose that person or that thing which is beloved to you, you experience sadness, and that's a consequence of hub, and it's a consequence of love, whether that love is sound or not sound. Okay, and so, but again, that's, we can't really say it's love itself. Sadness is love. It's one of the, you can say, manifestations of love. Okay, moving on now. Causes of love. Okay, so what causes a person to essentially love someone or to love something? The first thing he mentions essentially four stages. Okay, other scholars mention some other stages. Ibn Qayyim mentions 4. I think Ibn al-Jawzi in his Dammul Hawa mentions more. But the first thing is beauty itself. So when a person sees, or not just necessarily sees, but knows of something or someone that is beautiful, whether in form or whether in character, then this leads on to love. The second stage is the lover's perception of it. So it could be that beauty exists there, but because the person doesn't give much pay attention to it, he's oblivious to it, and doesn't want to pay much attention to it, then his heart doesn't become attached to that beauty itself. Okay. Now the topic of beauty itself is a huge topic, as I mentioned, because if we look to our religion, a lot of it revolves around beauty. The hadith, the Prophet says, "Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal." Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. Okay. One of the things that urges a believer to do good is in search of beauty in the afterlife. Okay, is in search of Jamal in the afterlife, to see, and the greatest pleasure in paradise, as we know, is to see Allah. The Prophet described it as being the greatest na'im. Okay, which teaches us something very important about the nature of the afterlife, that it's not just based upon carnal desires. So it's quite a typical, unfortunate, attitude that many people might have, including many non-Muslims, that they think, Muslims, they think that you'll have virgins in paradise and you drink wine and, you get married and, it's all like sensual and in that nature. But that's not the reality. Actually, the greatest delight in paradise is to see Allah, is to see that beauty. Okay? When it was a common genre of literature amongst the scholars of hadith was Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya, was to describe the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now you might think, what's the significance of a believer knowing how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam looked? Okay, we're taught to follow the sunnah of the Prophet, we're taught to follow his actions. And what significance does it have knowing how he looked? Because by knowing the beauty of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his physical features and in his character, brings your heart closer to him. Okay, and that's the type of literature and genre of literature that many people actually neglect. Okay, there is a very good translation of the Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya, which was published a few years ago, with a number of commentaries to it. I think it was by Dal al-Arqam, a commentary of Shama'il of Imam al-Tirmidhi. But that, subhanAllah, is a beautiful genre of literature that you should try and read into. Just to look at the description of the Prophet ﷺ, those ahadith that describe his beauty in terms of his countenance, but also in terms of his character as well. So we can see, beauty has a very, very important position within our religion. So once the beauty is there and the person comes across it, the next stage is the lover's perception of it. So the person perceives that beauty as it is. Okay, so he removes all of the things that could stand in his way to truly perceive the nature of that beauty. Sometimes it could be ideological, sometimes it could be intellectual, sometimes it's a physical barrier. Okay, depending on what the mahbub is. So that's the second thing. The third stage is the affinity itself. Before the perception, before we move on to affinity, so if we look to our religion, even when it comes to, say, I'll mention a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, the famous hadith of Alomgir ibn Shu'bah. He said that Muhibbin ibn Shu'bah, he said, I proposed to a woman for marriage. And the Prophet ﷺ said, did you see her? Have you seen her before? He said, no. Okay, so he's proposing for marriage, probably based upon hearing upon lineage, or of hearing then maybe that she's of good character and of beauty and what have you. And so the Prophet ﷺ asked him straight away, did you see her? And he replied, no. So he said, فانظر إليها فإنه أحرى أن يؤدم الحب بينكم or أن يؤدم بينكما. He said, then look at her. Look at her, for that in that way it is more likely that your love will be more, you can say, established between both of you. Okay? So this indicates that seeing someone, okay, and perceiving their beauty is obviously a very obvious way that love settles in a person's heart. Okay? Now this is a big topic. Okay? This is a big topic. And I got in trouble for it a few years ago, because I remember when I was at QM, and I was giving a lecture about a similar topic about love and marriage. I encouraged people to lower their gaze. So apparently that was against British values, and so I'm not coercing anyone to lower their gaze. Okay, engage as you normally do in university. Speak to your lecturers, look at them in their faces. There's no problem. Okay. But it's an interesting topic, because you'll find a group of scholars encouraged actually looking at beauty, because as we said, beauty has such an important position in our religion. They encourage people to look at beauty. Now, how do you look at beauty? Obviously, there's beauty in terms of creation, looking at the stars, looking at the constellations, looking at trees and mountains. You don't get much of that, unfortunately, in London, because we live in a concrete jungle. But there's still, there are still ways that you can see the beauty of Allah's creation. But even to the extent, what about looking at beauty? It's of the beauty of people, reflecting over the beauty of people. I remember I had a Christian friend who, he was like a born-again Christian. And he used to live near Edgware Road. As you know, Edgware Road, a lot of Arabs. So he came up to me and he said, I see these Arab women walking down Edgware Road, and I know them to be very pretty, but why do they cover their hair? What's wrong if I was to gaze? And he was saying in a very innocent way, not in a lustful way, as that's the way he would say it, but he wasn't out of lust. He was just saying, look, this is God's creation. If they have beautiful hair, why not show it? Why not show it? And so this type of attitude you even found among some people in the past. I'm not validating it, but a lot of it is based upon very questionable hadith. Like, for example, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said in a hadith, and this is not an authentic hadith, but where is that hadith? From to the effects that looking at a handsome countenance is a form of ibadah. Looking at a handsome face is a form of worship. Okay? And so and this might sound a bit strange, but there was this notion of looking at the faces of beardless youth. Okay? And I know it sounds strange, but, which can be interpreted in different ways. But But yeah, I mean, obviously that was a small fraction of, or a small section of maybe of our, scholarly heritage that encouraged something like that. But interesting, you find it in books of fiqh, what is called amrad. Amrad is a beardless youth, and they have rulings related to that as well. But anyway, that's another discussion. Okay, so yeah, this topic of gaze, we need to speak about it in more detail, which I think we will do in the next slide, hopefully, inshallah ta'ala. So that's to do with perception. The third stage is finding an affinity between yourself and the beloved. Finding a type of affinity between yourself and the beloved. What does that mean? As you know, I mean, nowadays we use the term compatibility. Okay, so when people find that someone has some affinity with somebody else, they tend to find that they can form a stronger relationship with that person. Affinity doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be identical in your sort of makeup of your characteristics and of your psychology and what have you. I mean, they say opposites attract. Okay, and even scholars in the past did discuss that concept: do opposites attract? And some scholars say yes, that's possible as long as their ethical standards do not differ with one another. So affinity, this goes way back to before we were even created. As we know, the famous hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said in a profound hadith in Sahih Muslim, Al-arwahu junudun mujannada, that the souls are troops collected together, meaning this is how they were, literally before we came into this existence. So al-arwahu junudun mujannada fama ta'arafa minha i'talafa, and those souls that were familiarized with each other prior to coming into this worldly life, then they would have affinity with one another in this life. So as we know, our souls existed before we came into this creation, and supposedly our souls intermingled and with one another prior to coming into this world. So those souls that got along with one another, they find that affinity in this life. But then you have those souls which وَمَا تَنَاكَرَ مِنْهَا اخْتَلَفَ, and those souls that opposed each other in the heaven or above us, then they would also be sort of divergent in this world. They would not find that affinity in this life. So after that stage, because it could be that you can recognize someone's beauty, you can perceive it, you understand it, you take it in, but you find no affinity because you're so different. Okay? You recognize the beauty, you understand it, you appreciate it, but you find no affinity. But when you find that affinity, then that is when that love begins to settle in a person's heart. So these are the three major sort of, as Ibn Qayyim understands it, the three major sort of stages towards a person attaining love, or we can say becoming someone who is classified as muhib, someone in a state of love. How long do I have? Okay. Okay. Now, then in another passage in his book, I mean, this was not actually from this part of the book, but he mentions it later on. So I thought I'll mention it together here. He mentioned some maybe more practical, or the points above are quite sort of theoretical, okay. But then he goes and breaks it down further. Some of the sort of practical things that lead on to you, for example, finding that affinity or recognizing the beauty, etc. So he mentions the four following things: glancing or gazing at the object, secondly, finding it beautiful or having that admiration, contemplation on the object seen, and then desire to possess it. Okay, desire to possess it. So let's begin with the next slide. I think the next slide that will. Okay. Before that, okay, just reflecting over the issue of glancing and gazing at the object. Now, here is quite a long chapter. So this is now chapter 6, Al-Bab al-Sadis, from Rawdatul Muhibbin. And he actually mentioned a lot of the sort of religious rulings, ahkam, related to one's gaze and glancing. So he quotes a famous passage from the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the believers, and from in Surah An-Nur, to lower their gaze. I didn't put it up here, but Surah An-Nur verse 30. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. Allah says, and tell the believing men to lower their gazes and to preserve their chastity. That is purer for them, and indeed Allah is all-knowing of what they do. وَقُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, and say to the believing women to also lower their gazes and to preserve their chastity as well. So here, Ibn Qayyim, he says, فَلَمَّا كَانَ غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ أَصْلًا لِحِفْظِ الْفَرْجِ بَدَأَ بِذِكْرِهِ. غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ, he said, it's the foundation upon which a person maintains his chastity. Lowering your gaze, it's the asl. It's a foundation by which you preserve your chastity. And وَلَمَّا كَانَ, and this is why Allah began with lowering the gaze, speaking about lowering the gaze before He spoke about preserving your chastity. Okay, so before speaking about essentially don't commit zina, He says lower your gaze first, because that's the first stage. If anything that leads to zina or fornication or adultery, it will be with a person unrestrictedly gazing at that which is not permissible for him to gaze at in that manner. ولما كان تحريم الوسائل فيباح للمصلحة الراجحة. And he says, since this prohibition, i.e. the prohibition of gazing, it's from those prohibitions which have been prohibited because because the unrestricted gazing is from the means which leads to haram. So you have certain things in our religion which are prohibited in essence, okay? They themselves are bad traits, are bad characteristics. For example, drinking alcohol in our religion is considered bad in and of itself, okay? Whereas at the same time, it's also, the prohibition is a means to preserve something greater as well. But as for lowering the gaze, a person might say, or looking at someone that is not halal for you, you might think, how is that inherently wrong? How is that inherently wrong? But we say this thing is prohibited, or unrestrictedly gazing at someone is prohibited as a matter of means. It prohibits as a wasila, because unrestrictedly gazing at someone is a means to, as we can see here, for a person to see the beauty of someone or of something, to perceive it, to find that affinity, and then it leads on to so much more. But if that is the case, he says, فَيُبَاحُ لِلْمَصْلَحَ الرَّاجِحَةِ. Okay? It is permissible to do so, though, if there is a overwhelming maslaha, benefit. Okay? If there is an overwhelming benefit, maslaha, then it's okay to look at someone of the opposite gender. Okay? So, make sure that's clear, inshallah. So, in for example, whether it be in work life or in studies, for example, you can't work with someone if you can't see them and talk to them directly face to face. Okay, so buying and selling, trade, being a witness in a court case or what have you, these are masalih, these are benefits, these are things that we need to do in life. So these things are permitted if there is a maslahah. Okay, but if there is no pressing need, then there's no need to gaze and to look. Okay, because it can lead to these potential harms. And then he mentions an important point. وَقَدْ جَعَلَ اللَّهُ الْعَيْنَ مِرْآةَ الْقَلْبِ. Ibn Qayyim, he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the eye a mirror to the heart. As a mirror to the heart, meaning it reflects what you see, it reflects onto the heart and it becomes imprinted onto the heart. Okay, this is the danger of unrestricted gazing, because if you look at something unrestrictedly, those images or the things that you have seen, they stay imprinted upon your heart. Okay, and so he says it's a mir'atul qalb. It's like it mirrors onto the heart. The Prophet, and then he mentions the well-known hadith. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كتب على ابن آدم حظه من الزنا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed that every son of Adam will fall into some form of zina. Every son of Adam will fall into some form of fornication. أدرك ذلك لا محالة. There's no way he can escape that. There's no way he's going to escape it. Everyone, some way or another, will fall into that. فالعين تزني وزناها النظر. The eye commits fornication, and the way the eye commits fornication is through an-nadhar. It's through unrestricted gazing. وَاللِّسَانُ يَزْنِي وَزِنَاهُ النُّطْقِ. And the tongue commits zina, and its zina is nutq, speaking. Meaning if you speak in a flirtatious way, for example, which leads on to zina, etc. وَالرِّجْلُ تَزْنِي وَزِنَاهُ الْخُطَى. And the foot, it commits zina, and its zina is when it walks to places of zina. وَالْيَدُ تَزْنِي وَزِنَاهُ الْبَطْشِ. And the hand commits zina, and the zina of the hand is al-batsh, meaning when you strike in order to attain your beloved or the person that you're going to commit zina with. وَالْقَلْبُ يَهْوَى وَيَتَمَنَّى. And the heart, yahwa, hawa. Yeah? It continuously desires and it wants more and it wishes. وَالْفَرْجُ يُصَدِّقُ ذَلِكَ أَوْ يُكَذِّبُهُ. And what lies in his heart, the Prophet ﷺ says, the private parts actualize what is in his heart or essentially rejects what's in his heart. Okay, so everyone has this hawa in himself, this inclination to maybe fall into fornication and to fall into haram. So what actualizes it is his private parts. But the real crux of the matter is the heart itself, is the qalb itself. The next mas'ala, or the next hadith that he mentions, an important hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, Ya Ali, لا تتبع النظرة النظرة فإن لك الأولى وليست لك الثانية. He said, Oh Ali, do not follow one glance with another glance. فإن لك الأولى, you have the first glance, which means when you see someone, your eyes just fall on someone at the first instance. That's okay, you're not to blame. You're not to blame. وَلَيْسَتْ لَكَ الثَّانِيَةِ. But you don't have the right to glance again. So you see someone and then you go again just staring. That's not appropriate. Okay? The first glance, it happened by chance or by accident. The second glance, however, you're in control of that. You're in control of that. He then mentions an interesting point. He says, here's a mas'ala. He says, مَا تَقُولُ السَّادَةُ الْعُلَمَاء فِي رَجُلٍ نَظَرَ إِلَى امْرَأَةٍ نَظْرَةً. What do you say? And here he's like posing a question that someone might ask. What do the scholars say of a man who sees a woman in one glance? فَعَلَّقَ حُبُّهَا بِقَلْبِهِ. And so his heart is attached to her. And he feels very attached to her. وَاشْتَدَّ عَلَيْهِ الْأَمْرِ. And now the matter has become very intense and severe. He's seen her one time, but only at one instance though. Okay. فقالت له نفسه. And so his nafs tells him, his nafs tells him, هذا كله من أول نظرة. This is all because of that one glance that you had. فلو أعدت النظر إليها لرأيتها دون ما في نفسك فسلوت عنها. So if you were to look again, you can sort of reassure yourself, and perhaps she was not as you expected or thought she was. Okay? Because of one single glance, maybe you didn't see her properly or what have you. Okay? So he said, فَهَلْ يَجُوزْ لَهُ تَعَمُّدُ النَّظَرِ ثَانِيًا لِهَذَا الْمَعْنَى. Is it okay for him to look at her again for that purpose? Now obviously the way I've mentioned here, I didn't give justice to it, but it sounds quite crude, okay, the way the question was posed. But if you think about it in reality, this probably does actually occur in that way. Okay, it does actually occur in that way. So you might see someone one time, and then that sort of starts off a spiral of thoughts, and so you think, no, I need to look again. Okay, I need to look again, and you'll justify in various different ways. So he says, فالجواب الحمد لله لا يجوز هذا لعشرة أوجه. He says this is not permissible for 10 reasons. I'm not going to go through all 10 because some of them are quite long. But he says, look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amara بغض البصر. Allah commanded us to lower our gaze. ولم يجعل شفاء القلب فيما حرمه على العبد. Allah will never place the cure for a sickness in that which He has made haram. If Allah made it haram, how can it be a solution for the problem that you are suffering from? Secondly, the Prophet ﷺ was asked about nadhar al-faj'ah. He was asked about the sudden glance. And he said, and he knows, وَقَدْ عَلِمَ أَنَّهُ يُؤَثِّرُ فِي الْقَلْبِ. And he knows that the first glance can have an impact on the heart. فَأَمَرَ بِمُدَاوَتِهِ بِصَرْفِ الْبَصَرِ لَا بِتَكْرَارِ النَّظَرِ. And so he said that the solution to this is بِصَرْفِ الْبَصَرِ, to move your to move your head away, essentially, and not by repeating your gaze. And there's an interesting hadith which is reported in Sahih Muslim and Bukhari, which I forgot to mention, that this was on the day of Eid. The Prophet ﷺ was when going from Muzdalifah to Mina. The Al-Fadl ibn Abbas was riding behind the Prophet ﷺ, and they passed by a group of women, and he just literally he began to stare at them. So the Prophet ﷺ sort of grabbed him by the head and just turned his head away. Okay. And so this is, as we can see, the Prophet is obviously trying to correct his actions and behavior here. And so we see this is the solution, not to allow him to look further, so that he can sort of dispel any possible doubts. Okay, because as we know, the shaitan, he likes to whisper into our hearts and give us false reasons to commit certain actions, which is really okay. And then after that QA, yeah? Okay. Yeah, so really, I'm not going to go for all the arguments, but in essence, what we find is that the shaitan, he will try and always, and this is very important, brothers and sisters, that you will always find that when your heart becomes attached to something or to someone or to an idea or to a notion, and your attachment, it's unhealthy and it's not a rational attachment, okay? You'll end up harming yourselves, and you'll end up justifying a lot of maybe haram or harmful things, okay? This happens, okay? And you'll come up with this sort of, I think I gave this example last time I was here. I think last time I was here it was about family rights, or yeah. So yeah, I think there was one case of a sister who wanted to marry a brother, but the brother, the wali, the guardian of the sister, didn't approve. Okay, so she really wanted to marry the brother, but her father sort of didn't approve. So she said, well, I don't actually need his approval anyway, because my father doesn't pray, and because he doesn't pray, that means he's not Muslim, so his guardianship is not valid. Yeah. Now, there are people like that. Okay, there are people like that, Now, obviously, in this case, it's quite obvious. If she wasn't planning to marry that brother, would she be, discommunicating her father from the religion? Of course not. Okay, of course not. That issue was never an issue in the past, but as soon as she wanted to marry that brother, her father now becomes a non-Muslim. So this is what happens. Okay, this is what happens. And believe me, if you find yourself in that position, in those difficult circumstances where you feel as though your heart is attached to someone or to something, okay, you will end up justifying things that previously you would have held to be impermissible. Okay, so be wary of that. Okay, be wary of that. Okay. Okay, so the glancing and then finding it beautiful, admiration. We've spoken about that when we discussed the lover's perception of it, and then the affinity, contemplation on the object seen. And which is, by the way, contemplation on the object seen. A lot of the scholars, they said, a person usually falls into ishq, or an intense form of love, usually when the qalb is fariq, when the heart is empty. When the heart is empty, okay, then it needs to be filled with the love for something or for someone. But if the heart is already preoccupied with with the love for someone or something else, then obviously it's not going to be filled in that way. And that's why one of the forms of love which I didn't explain about before, but which is called khulla. And khulla is a very intense form of love. Okay, and this is when essentially where a person's heart becomes filled with the love of someone or something to the degree that it cannot, the love for someone else cannot also occupy that person's heart as well. So as we know, the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he took two khalils from his creation, Ibrahim alayhi salam and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So he even said himself, لو اتخذت من الناس خليلا اتخذت أبا بكر. If I was to take someone as a khalil, as a friend, as a very, very close friend, I would have taken Abu Bakr. But Allah has chosen me to be his khalil. Okay? So, therefore, you'll generally find people that have a lot of free time, okay, they're not actively engaged in many sort of activities that they are attached to, okay? So, activities, or it could be projects, for example, that they feel attached to, then you'll find then it's very easy for them to fall into ishq, or fall into what they consider to be a type of healthy love. Okay? That's why you'll find, subhanAllah, the things that challenge love, it's not always people. Okay? Sometimes it's the it could be even your profession. I mean, how many times do you see marriages fail because a spouse's heart is so attached to their profession that it affects their relationship with their spouse. Okay, because their heart is full now. It's full with the desire or passion for another. Could be an art, it could be a profession, an occupation. I doubt it will be studies, but usually, unless you really love the knowledge that you study, which is maybe the case for Shari'i knowledge, but yeah. Okay. Benefits of lowering one's gaze. He mentions a number of benefits, which he also does in many other books as well. His book Rawdatul, okay, spiritual diseases and its cures, which by the way has been, from what I've seen, has been translated into English. It's called Spiritual Diseases and Its Cures, which is a very good book. I think all university students should read that book by Ibn Qayyim, published by Al-Firdaus Publications. I don't think it's a full translation of the book, but the main sections have been translated. So that's a good book. So he speaks about this topic quite a lot, the benefits of lowering one's gaze. So from amongst the benefits is that it saves the heart from feeling regret and heartache. Okay, so if you can control your gaze and from wandering around and looking unrestrictedly, then you save your heart from feeling that regret and heartache. And I think that's quite obvious. I don't need to explain why. Okay, and then he mentions so much poetry here that sort of reinforces that. Here one, يا من يرى سقمي يزيد وعلتي أعيا الطبيب لا تعجبن فهكذا تجني العيون على القلوب, which you can translate as, "O you who sees my sickness increase and my sickness sort of incapacitate," and it's difficult to translate this, but لا تعجبن فهكذا تجني العيون على القلوب. Don't be surprised to see me in such a state of illness. Why? فهكذا تجني العيون على القلوب, because this is what the eyes do to the hearts. This is what the eyes do to the hearts. The eyes, they make the hearts sick. Which leads on to another important discussion. What is to blame primarily? Is it the heart or the eyes? Okay, as you'll see in the next slide, there's a debate that he mentions. Okay, we'll go back to this. And he mentions it as a debate. So he said the eye will say this, the heart will say this, and they will blame each other for the unrestricted gaze. But we'll go back to that. We'll come to that, inshallah. So the second benefit is, he said, that it gives light to the heart. Life and light to the heart. Interestingly, he says, if you look to the verse about lowering the gaze, which we mentioned is in Surah An-Nur, and what is Surah An-Nur about? It's about light, the light of Allah. Surah An-Nur is about the light of Allah. And if you look at this surah, the main contents of this surah, as we mentioned, I think in our last lecture, about sort of family dynamics, I think, you'll find a lot of the themes and subjects revolve around having a healthy family structure, okay? Social habits that could potentially damage the family structure and the social structure. So, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after telling the believers to lower their gaze, Allah then says 5 verses later, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Thirdly, which is an interesting point, it leads to firasa. And firasa is a type of intuition, it's a type of deep insight that a person has. Because due to the clarity of their heart and the pureness of their heart, they are essentially able to really see the difference between right and wrong very, very clearly and very easily. To the extent that they can also almost, I don't want to say predict matters, okay, but due to the clarity of their vision and their inner vision, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them a deeper inner perception of things. It opens the doors to knowledge. The scholars have always said that one of the things that sort of prevents a person from seeking knowledge and being successful in seeking knowledge is when a person unrestrictedly gazes at that which is not permissible for him. It brings happiness and delight to the heart, etc. So he brings a number of benefits. I think in total he mentions here 10 benefits. And as I said, he done that again. He does that in some detail as well in his other book, ادعمونا, the spiritual diseases and its cures. So moving on to that slide, as we mentioned, inshallah, this is the last slide anyway. So the debate between the heart and the eye. So we've been speaking about these two, the eye and the heart quite a bit now. Now, here, what is to blame? Or who is to blame when it comes to sort of unrestrictedly gazing at something which is not permissible for you to look at? فقال القلب للعين. So he says, the heart will say to the eye, أنتِ سقتني إلى موارد الهلكات. You have led me to the path of destruction. وأوقعتني في الحسرات. And you have made me fall into so much regret due to, essentially, looking at that which is not permissible for you. ونزهت طرفك في تلك الرياض وطلبت الشفاء في الحدق المراض. So you've essentially withheld from looking at those gardens which were permissible for you to that which was impermissible. Which is an important point, I think, because this doesn't mean, and when we say a believer is someone who lowers his gaze, it doesn't mean he doesn't appreciate beauty. Okay, no, the believer is someone who should appreciate beauty. Okay, scholars always recommended gazing upon beautiful, scenery and beautiful things. Okay, so, we shouldn't be seen as people that prohibit everything that is nice and that is beautiful. No, as Muslims we should be people of beauty. As we said, Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. And He says, and you have disobeyed the command of Allah when He said, tell the believing men to lower their gazes, tell the believing women to lower their gazes. And then He mentions a hadith which He repeats so many times in this book, even though the hadith in reality maybe is not so authentic, but nonetheless its meaning is interesting. It says, النظر إلى المرأة سهم مسموم من سهام إبليس. Looking at someone who is not halal for you, okay, it is an arrow from the arrows of the devil, not from the arrows of Cupid. Okay, Cupid is made out to be some innocent, fluffy little baby, that wants to see good for you. It's the devil. Okay, it's the devil himself. فمن تركه من خوف الله أثابه الله إيمانا يجد حلاوته في قلبه. So whoever abandons that out of fear of Allah, or fear of disobeying Him, Allah will reward him with faith such that he finds the sweetness of faith in his heart. Okay, so this is from the positive consequences of lowering one's gaze, is that a person finds the sweetness of Iman. And as we said, this hadith, I'll give you the reference for it. No, strange. they've got the references here. But it's not, as I said, it's not a really an authentic hadith. There's a few other hadith to that effect as well. But the meaning, I don't believe it to be wrong. And likewise, he mentions the hadith that we mentioned before, like don't follow one gaze with another. You have the first glance, but you're not entitled to the second. But then the heart, it responds. Sorry, the eyes responds. The eyes respond and they say to the heart, قالت العين ظلمتني أولا وآخرا. You have been unjust to me from the beginning to the end. So he said, فأنت الملك المطاع. You, the heart, you are the king that is obeyed. وَنَحْنُ الْجُنُودُ وَالْأَتْبَاعُ. And we are just the followers, we are just the army. We obey your commands. أَرْكَبْتَنِي فِي حَاجَتِكَ خَيْرَ الْبَرِيدِ. I am just a messenger for what you want, essentially. So the heart can't blame the eyes. It's really the heart. It's the heart that essentially influences our limbs. And he gives as a proof of this the famous hadith, إِنَّ فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةً إِذَا صَلُحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ. That there is a morsel of flesh in the body. If it is sound, the rest of the body will be sound. وَإِذَا فَسَدَتْ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ. And if it becomes corrupt, the whole body becomes corrupt. أَلَا وَهِيَ الْقَلْبِ. Then indeed that is the heart. The heart is that morsel of flesh. Okay? So if the heart is sound, then the rest of the body will respond in a sound way. The limbs will respond in a sound way. So the heart is like the king, and he gives the commands, and so the limbs fulfill and respond to the commands of the king. But he concludes, Ibn Qayyim concludes on the next page with some lines of poetry. But in essence, he says that both are to blame. Both are to blame. You can't say one is free from blame. But they're both related. But primarily, we know that it's the heart that essentially dictates our behavior. So if your heart is truly sound and is truly pure, it will influence your limbs in a positive way. Okay? So that's how he concludes on that particular matter. There were a few other. I think we'll stop there. We'll stop there, inshallah. So I mean, that's just a review of 110 pages of the book, and the book is 400 pages. So inshallah, we'll be able to hopefully, I think next week, inshallah, be able to hopefully cover the remaining topics. Inshallah.
Okay, so the Sheikh will now be taking questions, and next week there'll be a specific session for sisters straight after the talk. Just not now because we have to, and we ain't got time for that. So if anyone has any questions, the Sheikh will take them. Anything that's written down, the sisters can, Rohana, can you collect them? And for brothers, Saad, inshallah, if you can just collect them from brothers. And if anyone wants to ask questions, the Sheikh will take them.
Sure, sit down.
Yeah.
Before everyone leaves, just to let you know, Foundations program is tomorrow. The Sheikh mentioned 2 books, Arba'in Nawawi and Rawdatul Salihin, books that every layman should know, and the lessons from it. The Foundations program covers a lot of that. Okay, so it's Tuesday, every Tuesday from since last week. Where? Yeah, it's going to be at Waterloo. Check the ISOC page for more details, inshallah. One other thing, there's elections happening. It's really important for the student population that we have that we run elections and we get involved. And we essentially have a voice within the university setting. So make sure you vote for the people that ISOC have endorsed. Off my head, I think it's Mr. Lareb, Brother Hanan, someone called Malik, I forgot the other one. My bad. Alright, and before you all remember, next week it's same location but 5 p.m. sharp, inshallah. So we can actually cover a lot more. I'll give the rest later, just so people. So yeah, this was
Yes, I think the first question was about the names of the books. So we've mentioned them. So those books are. I mentioned quite a few books. But if it's in reference to those 2 books of hadith, then the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi and Riyadh al-Salihin, also by Imam An-Nawawi. Yeah, Spiritual Disease and Its Cures by Ibn al-Qayyim as well, by the same author, published by Al-Firdaus Publications. Yes?
If a person was to marry outside of their race, but their parents don't agree with the decision, does that make it prohibited for the person?
Okay. So the brother asked that if someone wants to marry someone outside of their caste or ethnicity, and their parents refuse. Well, okay, there's a few issues here. Firstly, if it's the parents of the sister that are refusing, okay, the father in particular, or the wali of the sister that are refusing, then, as you know, a woman needs the permission of her father, of her wali, in order to get married. Now, if the father refuses based on issues related to ethnicity, that could be one or two scenarios. Okay. Number one, he refuses based on racism, meaning he's for example, he has negative connotations or beliefs about people from a different ethnicity or caste or what have you. This is obviously haram. This is not permissible. Okay. If, however, he refuses because the person is from a different background, ethnicity, and what have you, and he's worried about the future of his daughter, for example. So if his daughter is going to live in a household where he thinks that she will be mistreated because of her ethnicity is different to that of her husband's, and so he's worried about her welfare, then this is not an un-Islamic reason to object to the marriage. Okay? So it's not that ethnicity per se, it's due to the fact that the father or the guardian will be worried about the welfare of his daughter, not because of the ethnicity, but the way that she might be treated. Because, for example, in a certain culture, especially within Muslim communities, you'll find that, and it's unfortunate, but you'll find people look down upon people if they come from a different country or from a different caste, even within the same country. Okay, so for example, there are great tensions between Pakistanis and Indians. Okay, which is it can lead to huge issues. If and so the father might not personally have an issue with a Pakistani or an Indian, but he's worried that his daughter, for example, might be mistreated because she's Pakistani or Indian. Okay, and so I think, even if technically the guardian refuses based on an Islamic reason, okay, like pure racism or what have you, then that doesn't nullify his guardianship automatically. That's very important. It doesn't nullify his guardianship automatically. If a sister believes that her father, is being stubborn and will not marry her off at all, then she has a right to go to like a qadi or a judge or Islamic scholar and say, look, my father is not agreeing to any proposals, and so I want her, my guardianship to be, or I want either someone to speak to my father or the guardianship to be transferred to somebody else, and that can happen. But that's really the judge of a scholar or an imam or what have you. And it's not left to the discretion of anyone within the family per se. Okay. Hope does that answer the question? Yeah. What if it's a man? Okay. If it's a man, well, as I said, a man doesn't really have a wali, he doesn't have a guardian. Okay, so the decision of his parents at the end of the day are only there as a guideline, in the sense that obviously it's good to listen to the advice of your parents, but it's not a prerequisite. But having said that, if a person is under such difficulties and he's so concerned about that, then then maybe he is not in the position to go ahead with that marriage. Do you see? Because at the end of the day, it's not a prerequisite, it's not a condition. And if he's not strong enough to assert his own view, then that's an indication that perhaps it's better to look elsewhere. Yeah. Wallahu alam. If a person finds themselves in a state of having had a dangerous attachment and feel unable to help themselves past this state, what would you recommend as a cure? Yeah, this is inshallah something that we will speak about in a lot of detail next week, inshallah. Okay, so we'll speak about ishq and ilaj and how to cure it, inshallah. So that's something we'll discuss in more detail next week, inshallah. So we leave on a cliffhanger there.
Okay.
Now, if there's more questions, yeah.
On one of your slides, you said that knowing the ways leads to life and light.
Yeah.
Does the Quran also have the same sort of similar characteristics, or is there like a link between knowing the ways and the Quran?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. So,
the Quran
yeah.
is also described as a light.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Brings light to the heart.
Yeah.
So is there a link between the two?
Ah, okay. Yeah, I suppose there's a link between the two in the sense that because a person who doesn't essentially regulate his gaze correctly, then, as we said, one of the consequences of that is that it corrupts a person's heart. Okay, and so by lowering one's gaze, it helps to refine a person's heart and therefore leave it in its original state, which is that of purity. Because Allah has created people in a pure state, upon a fitrah. Okay, so it's created upon that light. So when we say nurun ala nur, light upon light, many scholars say this is the light of revelation in addition to the light of one's natural disposition. So when you have the light of your fitrah alongside the light of revelation, then that's when you get that amazing light which Allah speaks about in this surah. So when we say the lowering one gaze helps to have light in the heart, meaning it helps to preserve that light in essence, because otherwise not regulating your gaze corrupts the heart and therefore corrupts that light. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
You mentioned the point about gaze and how in certain conditions the overall benefit is that work conditions of that.
Yeah.
Is hijab a condition on that?
No, so meaning the person that you're looking at? No, it's not a condition. I mean, because you can look at a person's face even though they might not have hijab on, because you're not intentionally looking at that person's awra. So the face is not from the awra. The face is not from the awra. So you can look at the face as long as it doesn't lead to fitna. Okay? So whether it be in work or study purposes, looking at another person's face, okay, in order to attain that particular maslahah and benefit, is absolutely fine. Yeah.
Any questions, sisters? No?
You mentioned there's a debate between the heart and the eye. Is there like some sort of discussion between the mind and the heart?
Well, not in the book, not in that book, but
Which one is the human more in terms of desire, logic, passion?
yeah, this is actually in another book, Ibn Qayyim. I believe he doesn't put it as a debate per se, but in his book Kitab al-Ruh, the book of the soul, okay, he discusses the role of the aql, but I can't remember whether that was in relation to the heart or not. But he does discuss the role of the heart and the soul. Sorry, the intellect and the soul, the connection between the two. But I think that's from a different perspective, not from the perspective like passion and desires.
Any more questions? Before we finish, before everyone goes off and wash off, just remember, if you haven't joined the welfare Facebook page, KCL ISOP Welfare Project, join it. It has all of our events and any changes, just join it. Join the main ISOP page too. Check out our blog. Please try to understand some of the work, essentially, of prose and poetry written by fellow students to talk about their experiences. So just have a look at that, inshallah. And when the Sheikh were mentioned about, just one thing I just want to talk about before we disappear. The Sheikh mentioned, as Muslims, we appreciate beauty. I'm talking about that, as in even the beauty of creation in of itself. So I think every brother will testify that whenever we're on a mountain climb, the beauty was you can't. If you try to take a picture, it doesn't do justice. You have to use your own eyes. So I expect all you mans to turn up to the mountain climb, inshallah. And
You all need to go to Switzerland,
yeah,
in particular, yeah.
I took a trip to Switzerland.
Yeah.
Okay, you're gonna fund that. Okay. So as we remember, Ikhwan, the foundations foundations program tomorrow, and vote on the elections. Keep up to date with that, inshallah. That'll be all. Remember, this time, next week is, like I said, Monday 16th of October. We're gonna have the second part of this, probably the bulk of it. We will start at 5 p.m. Okay. And obviously we'll break for Maghrib, we'll come back, and after the session there will be a 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 after the